Thank you again, Tom. Hello, for those of you who were not here earlier or were having a little nap, my name's Piers Thompson, work for the Department for International Trade, the British Government, and my role is to facilitate overseas investment into UK regulated infrastructure and transport assets. I'm going to try and speak more slowly in this presentation, because I have to apologise for that. This presentation is about UK economically regulated assets and will be followed by presentations from organisations who currently successfully invest in those sectors. In my presentation, I will give you a brief introduction to the sector, explain how economic regulation works in the UK, the key benefits of economic regulation for investors, and some of the routes to investment in the sector. Prior to getting into the presentation, the key points I would like you to take away from the presentation are: 1, that UK regulated infrastructure sectors offer stable, low risk, long-term, inflation-linked cash flows. 2, that even though most of the assets are already in private hands, there's an annual 25 billion capital investment requirement from existing investors in these sectors, and that should create opportunities for new investors. And 3, that UK economic regulation is assessed by credit rating agencies as amongst the best in the world. Only Australian economic regulators have similar ratings. So, going into my presentation, the UK privatised many industries in the 1970s through to the 1990s. Some of these were competitive industries, such as oil exploration or British Airways, and did not need regulating to protect consumers. Competition was going to do that anyway. In the 1980s and the 1990s, however, a number of industries were privatised by government, which required the creation of economic regulators. These were mostly network industries with high barriers to entry, typically pipes and wire type assets. This means most regulators have a track record stretching back to the early 1990s. This provides credit rating agencies with confidence about the conduct of UK economic regulators and has shown to them that they are independent from government and that the method of appealing regulatory decisions in the UK is effective for companies and investors. To remove any questions you might have about the impact of Brexit on economic regulation in the UK, there should be none or very little. The UK was the first to privatise, liberalise and regulate its monopoly sectors. Since we have done so and proved the effectiveness of these approaches, the European Union has followed the UK's lead and not the other way around. This means that when we leave the European Union, the regulation of these sectors should not be impacted. The UK regulated asset sectors are already home to many overseas investors, some of whom will be familiar names to you. Many of these investors have chosen to invest in the UK because of its stable regulatory regimes. Moving on to my next slide, which covers what is regulated and by whom. Economic regulators in the UK are non-ministerial government departments. That is to say, there is no politician appointed by government to run them. This is deliberate so that those regulators are removed from party politics and are able to take a long-term view which balances the needs of consumers and investors. This means that regulators do not get removed from their office when there is a change of government. The Civil Aviation Authority, or the CAA, is the economic regulator for Heathrow Airport, which is viewed as being a market-dominant airport in the UK and able to dictate prices. The CAA are currently busy designing the regulation for the new £20 billion runway at Heathrow Airport. Heathrow has been in private hands since the 1980s. Ofgem is the energy regulator, which provides market oversight to energy retail markets, as well as economically regulating the gas and electricity transmission and distribution industries. In the energy sector, the value chain has been split so that generation is viewed as a competitive market, and retail of energy is viewed as a competitive market and not regulated. The network elements are regulated. The energy sector was privatised in the 1990s, and the Office of Road and Rail Regulation we've already covered. Ofwat, or the water regulator, regulates the water sector, which today includes the whole value chain in the water and sewerage sectors. That is to say, the reservoirs, water treatment works, supply pipes, retail of water, and also sewage and water treatment works. The water sector was privatised in the 1990s. I would like to give you a quick overview of the standard regulatory cycle. For most regulated infrastructure, has an ex-ante price control regulation with ex-post review. That is to say, the regulator and the company agree the business plan before the company executes it, and then the regulator reviews the execution of that business plan to ensure it has been done efficiently. Most price review periods are 5 to 8 years in length. Approximately 2 to 3 years before the start of the next price review, the regulator issues a public consultation about its approach in the next price review and invites stakeholders to respond. This consultation is about how the regulator will conduct that review and what they will look from the regulated companies. The consultation allows companies to make their views known and for investors to make their views known. This is a transparent process, but companies and investors can submit confidential responses which are not published. Following that consultation, the regulator publishes its methodology. So it consults on it, it allows responses, and then the methodology is published. So that this is fully transparent. This methodology tells companies what they're going to do and what is expected of them in the price review process. It covers capital investment, repairs, operations, tax, pensions. Companies will submit a draft business plan to the regulator, which will be reviewed. Again, this is published and all transparent. The company, following review by the regulator, will submit a final business plan, which is also published. And then the regulator will publish its final determination. So there's an iterative process here, which is through effectively negotiating the outcome of this process between the regulator and the company. The important thing about this is it sets the revenues for the next 5 to 8 years. It sets the duties and responsibilities of those companies for the next 5 to 8 years. And if the company is unhappy with it, it can appeal the outcome to the Competition and Markets Authority. There are relatively few reviews, and the outcome of those reviews have been mixed, so that sometimes the company wins, sometimes the regulator wins. Following the determinations, the companies submit regular annual reports to the regulator, their regulatory accounts, and also performance statistics. Those performance statistics are linked to output delivery incentives. So there's a financial reward or penalty to companies for under or overperforming. I mentioned before that there is a £25 billion annual capex requirement for these industries. It's shown here on this slide. It's based on average company capex from the last regulatory determinations. One thing to note, that this doesn't include the new runway at Heathrow and doesn't include High Speed 2 or Crossrail. At the bottom of the table, there is new transmission. That covers OFTOs, CATOs and interconnectors. Going to my next slide, you can see that OFTOs are the subsea cables which connect mainland networks to the UK, which another speaker will talk about shortly. CATOs are a new type of regulated asset and will be £100 million plus projects on the mainland network. The difference between OFTEs and CATOs, apart from OFTEs having to lay cables in the sea, is that CATOs are with construction stage projects. Ofgem, the energy regulator, will run competitions to procure organisations to build, finance and operate these new onshore transmission assets. I understand from Ofgem that after the current price review period finishes, there should be a pipeline of CATO projects in excess of £500 million a year. CATOs will have slightly different, they will have almost completely different regulation to the process I previously described. CATOs will have something akin to PPP type regulation, where it's effectively a 25-year contract or license with the regulator. Again, though it would be availability based. Electricity interconnectors are the other new regulated energy asset. These are electricity cables which connect the UK to other electricity markets. The capacity on the cable is auctioned to arbitrageurs who are exploiting the price differential between the UK and other electricity markets. Obviously, the value of that capacity will alter as prices diverge between the markets, which will reflect the intermittency of renewable generation, so there can be short-term differences as well as long-term. There are several interconnector projects with regulatory approval, and the regulatory mechanism is called cap and floor. This provides a guarantee of the minimum level of revenue at the floor, ensuring that operating costs, debt and depreciation are funded, and then a cap on revenues. The cap is essentially a requirement of EU regulation, but Ofgem have recognised that if there's a cap on your upside, there should be a limit to your downside as well. I've included a diagram on this slide, which is a high-level regulatory finance diagram. This is an example from the water industry at the last price review. This is broadly similar for electricity and gas distribution and transmission networks. I won't try and break the diagram down on screen, but I'd like to highlight a couple of components. The bottom of the diagram is the RCV, or regulatory capital value. This is essentially the regulator's view of the company balance sheet. Other regulators have different names for it, but it's essentially the same thing. The interesting thing from an investor's perspective is that the RCV concept ensures that investments made by companies today or historically will be paid out over the long term. The RCV is essentially a guarantee that you will receive your money. It's depreciated at a rate determined by the regulator, depending on the life of the assets sitting inside it. The regulator also determines a cost of capital which is applied to the RCV. This cost of capital is currently quite low due to regulatory assumptions around gearing and the current low cost of debt. However, as the cost of capital has fallen, the strength of financial incentives performance has increased. And a reference to performance incentives is shown at the bottom of the diagram next to the RCV arrow. Of course, I'm not just here to give you a presentation on regulatory finance in UK infrastructure. I'm here to promote investing in it. There are several ways to do so: buying debt or equity in regulated companies on the open market, though I will observe that most regulated utilities in the UK are now owned off-market, with only a few listed examples remaining. Many institutional investors have bought stakes directly in companies, as you may have seen as I flicked through the slides earlier. This may also be an option of interest to investors from Japan, and if so, we would suggest finding an experienced UK partner who understands the market and the regulation. There's also the potential to invest in the sector through infrastructure platforms. This is more relevant to the areas of new transmission, where investors could invest through a platform of expert project developers. And another option is to invest through an infrastructure fund into either infrastructure debt or equity. There are both listed and unlisted UK infrastructure funds, but I don't want to duplicate areas which will be covered by my next speaker. Tried to keep this relatively high level, and I hope you found this presentation interesting. Whilst I haven't been able to go too in-depth on the areas I've covered, and I've not spoken too quickly, I would like you to take away from this that the UK has excellent long-term independent economic regulation. Investing in UK infrastructure provides low-risk, inflation-adjusted returns, and the ongoing CapEx requirement, capital investment requirement in regulated infrastructure means there are opportunities for new investors. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them by email or afterwards. Please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.